Hi, Emre, and thanks for meeting me for this interview.
Thank you,
Uh,
Zig.
you teach business and entrepreneurship, and you wrote a book about entrepreneurship where you teach the reader how to use grid to make better decisions. We're gonna talk about that a bit later, but first, a little bit about yourself, maybe. Your background is in physics and engineering. How did you end up in business and entrepreneurship?
Right. So before I came to college here in the US, I was in Turkey, Istanbul, Turkey. And what I tell my students is that 95% of what I know about entrepreneurship, I learned selling tomatoes and eggs in the bazaars of Istanbul. So I had it, I guess, in my entrepreneurship, in my DNA. And when I came over to the US and got exposed to technology and liberal arts and so on, I was able to combine what I learned at the bazaars of Istanbul with what I learned from a scientific and technology point of view. I did my master's thesis at the University of Arizona on something called digital mammography, which was just beginning at the time. And then I was lucky enough to convert that thesis into a product and then a company that eventually was acquired by a public company. So that's how I got into entrepreneurship myself.
Wow, interesting background you have there.
Thank you.
So now you and your colleague, Michael Kinch, you wrote this book, The Pantheon and the Mortuary, about entrepreneurship. How did this book come to be?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I'm from a scientific training background. So, I've always tried to apply principles of science into entrepreneurship also. And I always claim that the scientific method is also applicable to entrepreneurship. And so, in all the interactions that I've had with the students, I was encouraging them to state the hypothesis, make some assumptions, be comfortable with the fact that each of those assumptions are going to have wide uncertainty associated with them. And when I stumbled onto Grid by chance, I saw that it provided a perfect platform, really, for students as well as entrepreneurs, as well as even myself, to deal logically with the fact that we're swimming in a sea of unknowns. And we need to put some structure on those unknowns and not let it dissuade us from continuing with the idea. And so the book was really initiated by my working with Grid. And in order to make it a more interesting book, what we decided to do was to base it on case studies. And in each case study, not only would we apply Grid, but we would also use that case study as an opportunity to introduce some terms associated with entrepreneurship, associated with business, so that students would also be able to articulate what it is that they were doing.
Okay, yeah, and in the book you talk about startups failing because they failed to ask the right questions and kind of do the math before starting. What presumption is the most common one,
Yeah.
in your opinion, to get wrong in this way?
I think the most common error is not accommodating idealism with realism uh, together. So most students that I've seen are very idealistic. If they see a problem and that problem irritates them, they believe that if they come up with the solution, everybody will start using this solution, and uh, the value of the solution, how much people might pay for this solution when we try to disseminate the solution, is not considered much. So again, going back to the use of Grid, what Grid allows them to do is to make some concrete quantitative assumptions and let Grid paint a picture of the future. And that picture of the future will get less and less fuzzy as you shrink the uncertainty ranges associated with each of your assumptions. And the reality is that most often the picture of the future is going to converge towards a failure scenario, and occasionally it will converge towards a success scenario. But as a scientist, I want things to converge to reality, and I want students to see this convergence of the picture of the future that they have in mind converge toward reality, and be able to modify their idea, recheck their assumptions, to see whether there is any chance of the picture of the future converging towards a success scenario.
Yeah. I wonder, like, since so many people seem to fail at doing this kind of research beforehand, I wonder why it happens so often. Is it a lack of knowledge or training, tools, just time maybe?
Yeah. So I see two channels that entrepreneurs go through. One of them is, and we discussed this in the book, what I call gaining knowledge channel. And the other channel is gaining wisdom channel. Gaining knowledge for most students, for most entrepreneurs, is fairly straightforward. You can study kind of a recipe as to how successful entrepreneurs have approached an innovative idea. How did they validate it? How did they articulate it? How did they execute on it, and so on? So most often the failures do not occur because of a lack of knowledge. The failures occur because of a lack of wisdom. What do we mean by that? Like fear of rejection, fear of failure, inability to read other people's faces, like customers' faces or co-founders' faces or employees' faces, and then act accordingly. One thing that I used to tell my wife in my own startups was 95% of what I do is human psychology, 5% is everything else, including all the technical training that I've had. So in a sense, what we attempt to do with Grid is a necessary but not sufficient component of achieving success in the entrepreneurial world. You can have all the idealism, you can have all the emotions under control. You can be a very wise young person, but you still have to have the ability to do arm's length analytical assessment of the situation, which Grid enables one to do, in my mind.
Wow, that's so interesting to hear you talk about the importance of what you could call like the soft skills.
Right. And I really call it wisdom because it generally comes through experience. It's more difficult to teach a student how not to fear failure, but to learn from each failure as quickly and as cheaply as possible. These are difficult things to convey to people who are extremely young. You must have lived it in order to get to that point, So sharing of experiences and so on. There's actually one more channel. So gain wisdom, gain knowledge. And then the third channel is be willing to do grunt work. So grunt work is like cold calling 30 potential customers and asking them if such a thing existed, how much might they be willing to pay and why. So this grunt work component is actually something that feeds the Grid assumptions, because what you're trying to do, again, is to squeeze down the uncertainty range associated with each assumption so that the picture of the future has a chance to converge towards reality.
Yeah, I wonder whether you could gain wisdom from doing experiments in a tool like Grid, so you can experiment with the assumption and see the results, and then you can fail on the computer screen instead of the real world.
Absolutely. I mean, numbers don't lie. You ask 3 of your friends and they say, oh, I'd pay $200 for this. But when you ask 100 people, the average drops down to $3. And the standard deviation around that price is plus or minus 50 cents. That's a oops moment that the combination of the kind of discipline that grid imposes on students, plus the willingness to do grunt work and put yourself out there and not be embarrassed about calling potential customers, etc., comes into play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned a bit about how the book explains kind of key business concepts for startups, and kind of teaches the readers to use grid to visualize their data and check these things visually. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit like why you choose grid for this. What is it that you see in grid that helps?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I stumbled onto grid. Nobody came and told me. I think I just saw a YouTube video of it and I was intrigued by it, and I started using it myself, initially in some very simple conditions and so on. And I had myself attempted to come up with something that would have similar results as grid, which is creating scenarios and then looking at changing an assumption and seeing the impact on the scenario. And it was so time consuming and not user friendly that when I saw grid, and again, I should emphasize that I have zero financial interest in grid. This is just my objective assessment of grid. I was extremely happy that somebody had come up with something that made it so easy for me to convey both concepts and approach to my entrepreneurship students.
It's very nice to hear that. And I wonder, like, what tools did you use before this? Like, was it just
Excel?
Just
Excel and kind of hard-coded versions of Excel is what we used before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So one thing that I think about in all this is that as we gain these tools that give us almost new capabilities, and I wonder, how do you think these tools affect the way we think? Like, do we think in a more agile way if you have more agile tools? What are we able to do now that we couldn't do before with some with less capabilities?
Yeah. So first we have to define who we is. In my mind, we are either entrepreneurs who want to be entrepreneurs, or students of entrepreneurship and so on. So if we focus on that group, without any doubt in my mind, it provides tremendous capability for, if you have a control group that wasn't using grid, I haven't done this experiment, versus another group that had no access to something like grid, my hypothesis would be that the group that was using grid to kind of put some logic around their thinking and what they need to do, how they need to do it, etc., would be far more successful in terms of either validating or invalidating their idea. Not successful in terms of creating, startups, but just the ability to validate and validate. Also, this is an interesting time with the introduction of ChatGPT and so on. So I know that you guys have been working on incorporating some AI features into grid. The way I use ChatGPT with my students with grid is, any question that you ask ChatGPT has a range associated with it, like how many people use heart stents in the United States, and it will give a range. Well, that's what I'm after. I want to start off with ranges that I can then fine tune. So the combination of the capabilities that ChatGPT is giving students in terms of market research and so on and so forth, plus the structured approach that grid provides, in my opinion, ought to create entrepreneurs with a higher probability of success.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about you teaching students business, but you've also been in the startup world yourself for many years now. Do you see a difference there in how people approach their like the financial analysis of
Yeah.
these kinds of ventures.
Yeah.
How do you, and like, how do you see it changing in the future?
Yeah. So I think with the tools that are available, when I started my startups, looking back now, it was like a blind faith and tremendous hubris to think that I could do what I turned out I was able to do. In fact, lots of people told me when I started my startup, this is never going to work. Are you crazy? What are you doing? In a sense, what helped me out was, even though I didn't have the explicit tools, my way of thinking, the scientific method approach was in my subconscious. I was applying it. So the big change now is these tools are so much more explicit than they were when I was dabbling in entrepreneurship. Now, I'm no longer, well, I'm still an entrepreneur at heart, and I do have some startups ongoing, but in my investment decisions, this is serious. In every single investment decision, I use grid, and I force the investor to tell me, what are your key assumptions? What is your minimal, maximal, nominal estimate of each of these assumptions? And then turn it over to me. I'll crank out the math and I'll paint the picture of the future using grid, and then I'll make my investment decision accordingly. So it's not, in my opinion, again, I know I'm sounding very favorably biased about grid, but this is my reality. In my opinion, grid is a useful tool, not just for entrepreneurs, but investors, in particular, angel investors investing in very early stage opportunities. And we discussed this in the book also.
Yeah, very nice. So we're coming to the end of this interview. Are there any final thoughts you'd want to share with us? Something we skipped?
Yeah, I think I get to see, in general, if we make generalization, I get to see two types of students or entrepreneurs. One of them I'll categorize as, scientific, technical strengths, and the other one is business strengths. And what I recommend to the scientists and the technologists is that they're going to benefit tremendously from developing an understanding of the culture and the thinking modes of business. And similarly, for those people who are more focused on business, they're going to benefit a lot from having an appreciation for the language and culture of science and the way of thinking of science. And then both groups are going to benefit tremendously from improving their understanding of human nature, meaning, humanities and liberal arts. So the combination of, I know I'm asking for too much from students, but a combination of, technical savvy, scientific understanding, coupled with the realities of life in business, coupled with human nature and psychology, is what creates success, in my opinion, for young people.
I think those are fantastic final words. Thank you so much for this chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Siggi.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.